These are the 5 things that I want from Xenoblade Chronicles. Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and I've played Xenoblade for a long time. Close to 10 years at this point. My, how time flies. And it dawned on me that I haven't done a Xenoblade video for this series yet. So let's address that and fix it right now. And we're going to start off with number 1, Xenoblade Chronicles X 2. I love Xenoblade X. It is a game that I fundamentally believe in, and I am ecstatic that we're getting Definitive Edition for Xenoblade Chronicles X alongside new story, because Xenoblade X ended on a cliffhanger, a massive one at that. Not just for one plot thread, but it really seemed that they had a specific vision for where they wanted this story to go, and they wanted this to unravel, almost be an entire thing by itself. There was so much to still do, so much to still see, so much to still discover and unravel about Mira and this world that they created with X. And I'm sorry, but I just don't see the new story in X Definitive Edition properly wrapping up every single plot thread. I just don't see it. I don't think that's what its goal or purpose is. I think it's going to take one of those plot threads and address it, but there's still a bunch others out there that I would love to see addressed and expanded on in the future. I love the flow of Xenoblade X. In terms of straight up gameplay and world exploration, I think X is second to none in all of Xenoblade. It's a formula and an identity that I hope is iterated on in the future and expanded and fleshed out and innovated on. And I want to see a sequel. I want to see from the ground up another attempt at this formula. So I hope Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition is 1, good, then sells well because it's good, which then inspires Monolith and Nintendo to do more with X as an idea. Whether that means bringing those ideas into the main series with Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3 by bringing X into the canon, or implementing the gameplay style from X for the main series going forward, or just making a Xenoblade X2, I'm fine with any of those possibilities. I just want to see this formula iterated on in the future and expanded on, because I think the sky is the limit here. It's fun, it's customizable, there's so many different builds, so many different ways to customize your game and experience, and while the UI in the original X was turbo bad, the one in X Definitive Edition looked at least competent. That's a massive step up and an improvement. X was always one of those games, much like Xenoblade 2, that was really rough around the edges, but if you could get past those rough edges and appreciate the core of what was there and on offer, you fell in love with the game, and that's what happened with me for X and Xenoblade 2. There's a reason X and 2 are my 2 favorite Xenoblade games of all time. It's because despite those rough issues, despite those jagged edges, those peaks and valleys, I appreciated the good that was there, and I enjoyed the good so much it overshadowed the bad for me. And if you haven't played X, I think you'll find out what I'm talking about when it comes to X Definitive Edition. When you actually get the combat kind of down pat, you don't have to understand all of it or every different mechanic, but once you have a decent fundamental understanding of the flow and the pacing going on, and you really start to sink your teeth into it, it's really fun, but it's not perfect. And that brings us to point 2 here. The second thing that I want from Xenoblade, bearing in mind, by the way, there's no order to this list. I would love to see Xenoblade revamp the combat going into the future. Of the 4 Xenoblade games we have on offer right now, also including the DLC, I think X has the best combat. With the use of limb targeting and the various different builds you can go down and customize with different weapons that have different arts, and the ways you can customize those arts. Things with scale combat as well. The scale, the beauty, the flow of it, rather good. However, the thing I've always thought was holding Xenoblade back from becoming a massive RPG series, and while Xenoblade is growing, don't get me wrong, I think it is on an upward trend, I still think of all the things about it, it's the early game pacing and the combat that's holding it back from really breaking out and being way more loved and appreciated than it is right now. The combat in Xenoblade across the board can be rather slow, especially early on, and the idea that it gets better or good 40 hours in is not acceptable in my eyes. That's still 40 hours of someone's life they have to put into a game with the hope that at the end of that, and when they come out the other side, they'll enjoy the combat. The combat should be good from the get-go. It should be good immediately. It can be. I think 3 got the combat online way quicker. it only took a couple of hours. But even then, there can still be times where you have giant swaths of downtime where you're just not really doing anything, and because of the nature of the art system, a lot of the actual attacks you do across the board in Xenoblade can feel rather floaty and, I wouldn't say unresponsive, but when they hit, you don't get that big visceral feeling like, oh hell yeah dude, backstab. It's like, alright, cool, backstab. I think it's because Xenoblade, across the board, elicits this feeling of trying to play a hotkey tab targeting based MMORPG combat loop akin to say World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV, but condensed to work in controller, and it both works and doesn't. I think if Xenoblade wants to really become more popular and expand into the future, combat is one of those avenues it would really need to address when it comes to new entries, and also getting the combat loop online and being really fun and interesting quickly, like almost immediately. I don't think you have to necessarily throw the entire combat loop out the freaking window or anything, and I don't think it's necessary to become, say, a Souls-like or a Platinum-style hack and slash. I don't think Xenoblade needs that, though I am fans of those kinds of games, so I mean, I wouldn't mind. I just don't think it's necessary. But they need to find a way to tinker with the combat loop to make it feel more active and responsive, so that when you use your arts, it feels like this big moment. And if you're going to rely on the Holy Trinity, and by that I mean tanking, healing, and damage, those three need to feel really good. And I don't think tanking, for the most part, has ever felt particularly that good in Xenoblade. It varies a little bit, but I thought it was particularly weak feeling in Xenoblade 3. That's not meaning that numbers-wise it wasn't good. I'm just saying in terms of, does it feel good to play? Is it fun? I wouldn't argue 3 is a good example of tanking. Or even really healing, though I kind of understand what they're going for there. I think the combat loop and the pacing overall needs a serious look at when it comes to where do we take this series going into the future. Those are the elements that I think need addressing the most. And then if you do, and by you I mean Nintendo and Monolith, end up making the combat feel more active and responsive, this next point will especially become important in my opinion. And number 3, 60 FPS. For the love of Christ, dude, it is the year 2025. I can write off the Switch just based on performance and the fact that Xenoblade is able to run on this freaking thing to begin with. Borderline feels like wizardry and necromancy all in one. However, as everyone and their mother expects the Switch 2 to come out this year, when Xenoblade starts coming online for the Switch 2 and going into the future for future entries, I would like to see baseline 60 FPS across the board, or at least a mode to toggle it on. That is important for me. It's not important for everyone, hence the toggle. If you prioritize graphical fidelity or things like that, you can then go for that mode. Other games, especially on console, do that all the time. However, for me, it is important. Xenoblade, because it doesn't run at 60 FPS, feels worse than it should. Doesn't mean that it's a bad game or anything like that, but it feels worse than if it was 60 FPS, because it does play worse, because that's how frame rate works. So when Xenoblade is able to make use of better hardware, I don't necessarily want to see photorealistic graphics or anything like that. I don't want to see how they can, like, squeeze every bit of graphical fidelity out of new hardware that they possibly can. Xenoblade works so well because of scale, scope, and artistic vision, binding it all together and making a beautiful visual spectacle, a veritable feast for the eyes. And if we can get a halfway decent frame rate, that would be amazing for me. It would also make the games just fundamentally play better, leading to my previous point as well. Now, this one is quite connected to this 60 FPS mode going into the future for Xenoblade, because point number 4 is I would love Switch 2 versions of Xenoblade 1, 2, 3, and X. I'm not just talking backwards compatibility, I am talking updated visuals and frame rate for Xenoblade 1, 2, 3, and X. I don't need an entire new version or anything like that, but as we've seen with other games for other consoles, when they get a new, console, for the most part, yes, I'm still sore about Bloodborne. Generally, a patch comes online to make use of the better hardware so that older games look better on newer hardware. I would love to see that happen for Xenoblade 1, 2, 3, and X. More crisp visuals alongside 60 FPS. I'd replay the entire franchise just to experience what that would feel like. And it's something that I think could help reinvigorate interest and passion for Xenoblade on the whole, because Xenoblade tends to be some of the most gorgeous looking games on Nintendo consoles, just point blank. full stop. And one of the things people are celebrating a lot in regards to Xenoblade X Definitive Edition is the fact that all of Xenoblade will now be available on one console with the Switch. But when we move to the Switch 2, we're gonna run into the same problem again. But if these games are fully backwards compatible, which they've talked about that a lot of Switch games will be backwards compatible onto the Switch 2, if they're not just backwards compatible and they're also playing better than ever on Switch 2, that could do a lot of good for the IP and its longevity. Especially if you come out with another banger Xenoblade game for the Switch 2, if someone only has a Switch 2 and they don't want to feel like they're playing necessarily an old game, having better versions of the old games, they can just seamlessly dive into it. Now, speaking on all of this, let's go to point 5, because point 5 for me is the most unique entry in this list, because it's not necessarily any one thing Xenoblade can do to necessarily please me. I just want to see Xenoblade as a whole do well. It's one of my favorite IP in all of gaming. I grew up with Xenoblade. My first game was Xenoblade X, and I fell in love with the IP with Xenoblade 2, and I waited with bated breath for them to eventually port Xenoblade 1 Definitive Edition and then also release Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and I enjoyed those games a whole lot. And with the upcoming release of Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, we're kind of going back to where it all began for me. Mira, Xenoblade X, Lau, Elma, Vandam, New LA, Skells, Primordia. A lot of memories for me in that game world. And I think it is fair to say that Xenoblade doesn't have the same sway or heft as, say, a lot of these other much more established and popular RPG and JRPG series that are out there. But I think in terms of overall quality and story and characters and potential, I think it's right up there with the greats. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, far from it, but it's one of those series that does so well in spite of its issues, because the things that it does so well, for me at least, largely overshadow those issues. But I can understand why a bunch of other people can't get into the series because of those issues, because they can be annoying. Field skills in Xenoblade 2 are a prime example of this. Just a bunch of weird and jarring game design that doesn't need to be there, that just acts as unnecessary friction that doesn't add to the experience overall. I think if those elements are sanded and eroded away going into the future, I think Xenoblade can really find some breakout success. We saw Xenoblade as an IP gain a lot more motion when it came to Xenoblade 2 coming out, Pyra and Mithra being added to Smash, Xenoblade 3, Xenoblade 1 Definitive Edition. I'm sure Xenoblade X Definitive Edition will probably do pretty well. And then we come into the question of, where does Xenoblade go from here? Xenoblade 4 is almost certain in a few years, like that's what I think they're going to do next. And if Xenoblade 4 can take an honest to good look at everything that's come before, and I don't just mean Xenoblade here, I'm talking about Xenosaga and Xenogears. Yeah, those IP are owned by different companies, but that's irrelevant here. Take a good hard look at why people love those games so much and continue to do that. But look, an honest to God analysis at everything that's come up to now, at the things that people didn't like, what didn't work, what detracted from the experience instead of adding to it. Address those elements, analyze those elements, understand philosophically why they didn't work, and then learn going into the future. Another one of my favorite game franchises of all time is Persona, and Atlus as a studio is becoming one of my favorites as well. And I think one of the reasons that we have seen that studio rise to fame and popularity in recent years is because they largely do what I just talked about. When you look at those games from that studio Atlus, in chronological order in terms of when they came out, when they released, and you compare them side by side, you can analyze and find exactly what Atlus deemed to be an issue and what they deemed to be a strength. Because in the next entry, they directly respond to that feedback, to those problems, to those perceived issues, and try and make it a better experience next time. You go from Persona 3 Original, to Persona 4, to Persona 5, to Persona 5 Royal, Persona 3 Reload, now Metaphor ReFantazio. You look and you analyze, going from one experience to the next, and they sand away a lot of those rough edges, those awkward design choices that don't really contribute much to the overall experience besides adding frustration and annoyance that doesn't need to be there. And they can even turn those issues into strengths. Dungeon design from Atlus is a great example of this. When you analyze the dungeon design going from P3 to P4 then to P5, they change it a lot, and I think Xenoblade can and should look at itself with a similar mindset. Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3 change and alter from one to the other in drastic ways. to the point where they can feel very different to one another. I think the heart-to-heart system is a great example of Monolith doing what I'm talking about here, but sometimes they learn the wrong lessons. Xenoblade 1 had a lot of heart-to-heart, same with Xenoblade X, but they can be a little bit awkward to unlock because of the affinity system. Then you go to Xenoblade 2, but here they're also voiced, and you get more than one-on-one conversations. I think Xenoblade 2 far and away has the best heart-to-heart system in all of Xenoblade, and I don't think it's particularly close. And then you go to Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and they throw the heart-to-heart system out the freaking window for no reason, and they replace it with these campfire chats at camp, and they suck. I'll be frank about it, I think they suck. They're far and away the worst heart-to-hearts, quote-unquote, in the entire franchise, and I don't think it's close. They're largely unvoiced, they all look the freaking same because they all happen at camp, and they lack the diversity, they lack the variance, they lack the charm, the heart, the passion that the heart-to-hearts of old had. I think it's an example of Monolith not necessarily taking the best lessons to heart there. And when it comes to combat, they do something similar. But again, bit hit or miss for me. You go from Xenoblade 1 and X, and you have that one horizontal bar filled with arts, reminding me of a hotbar in an MMORPG. Then you go to 2 and 3, and they replace that hotbar with the face buttons on your controller, with either X, Y, B, or the D-pad. A quicker, more seamless, and natural way to input these buttons for controller, and it works. A smart lesson that was learned there. However, in Xenoblade 2 at least, unless you spec into certain kinds of builds, it can be really slow, since you don't have that many buttons to press, since they all have short cooldowns, and they can line up in such a way where you're just standing there without much to really do, besides reposition yourself, and that's not particularly that fun or interesting or thrilling. So how do they address that in Xenoblade 3? Well, let you swap characters to different party members. Since each party member can be a different class or its own character, if you just swap to a different character, you have all new buttons to press. But their arts might also be on cooldown. Bit of an interesting predicament we find ourselves in, isn't it? Hence going back to that previous point I talked about in terms of revamping the combat system, because I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer here. But I think something needs to change. I think this is an element that I think Monolith really needs to improve on more so than anything before. They need to do a really good job of looking at what came before and properly identifying what was wrong, what worked, how do we maintain what worked and what was so good while sanding out those rough edges. I think they try to do this, but it can be hit or miss, at least in my eyes. And you may disagree, almost knocked my glasses off there, and you may disagree, and that's fine, because that's the beauty of Xenoblade, and that's the beauty of gaming. We all have our own different preferences, our own different experiences, ways we interact, the ways we interface with this game, with this IP, with this franchise, and we get different things out of it. It's one of the beautiful things about gaming, in my opinion. But having a cohesive vision, something that is identifiable, something that feels uniquely and inherently Xenoblade. I think Xenoblade does have these elements, but I think they can lean into them a little bit more. Find that formula that finally works for this IP and really hone in on it, and stick with it, and take it into the future, and run with it. Because I think Xenoblade can and should be way bigger, way more popular than it is right now. And I think it's been going through some growing pains over the last few entries. Because Xeno, for the longest time, has always tried to find a place to belong, a place to firmly place its feet and say, I am here. Went through this with Xenogears, Xenosaga, and now we're here with Xenoblade. And seemingly this is the one that's working. I want to see it be better than ever before. I want to see it grow. I want to see it prosper, because I love Xenoblade. And with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and help support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe. Have a great day. Leave a comment down below with what you would like to see out of Xenoblade going into the future. Be 1 thing, 2 things, 3 things, 4 things, 5 things, however many. I'd love to hear your thoughts, hear your opinions, and hear your perspectives. Stay safe. Have a great day. Go play some video games if you can. Dream big, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.